Imagine waking up one morning and not knowing who you are. Not amnesia, not a dream. Someone made you forget. Someone in a white coat, in a government-funded building, with a clearance level you were never meant to see, decided your mind was a laboratory. And the worst part? It worked. Visual, dark hallway, flickering fluorescent light, a woman staring blankly at a mirror. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This isn't fiction. This happened to real people, on real streets, in hospitals, in university clinics, in the bedrooms of ordinary citizens who had absolutely no idea their own government had declared a silent war on the human mind. But here's what the history books leave out. The experiment didn't just fail, it succeeded. Horrifically. Completely. And that success, that monstrous, documented, undeniable success, is the exact reason it had to disappear forever. Visual stamped documents, top secret, fire-consuming paper. To understand how something this dark could happen in broad daylight, you have to go back to a moment when the most powerful nation on Earth was quietly losing its mind, out of fear. It was 1950. The war was over. The victory parades had ended. But American intelligence agencies were staring at something that terrified them far more than any nuclear weapon. They were watching their own soldiers come home from Korea, hollow-eyed, robotic, reciting communist ideology like they'd been reprogrammed. Trained men, decorated soldiers, changed. The question wasn't if the Soviets had developed some form of psychological manipulation. The question, the one that kept CIA directors awake at 3 a.m., was how far ahead they already were. And that fear produced a decision that would destroy hundreds of innocent lives. Visual, black and white CIA headquarters, men in suits, closed-door meetings. In April 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles signed off on a program so classified it didn't appear in any official budget. No name on record, no oversight committee, just a memo, a code, and an unlimited mandate to answer one question by any means necessary. They called it MKUltra. And what began as a defensive research program became something else entirely. Something that would take 20 years, hundreds of victims, and a bureaucratic accident to finally drag into the light. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the man they chose to run it. Visual, black and white photograph, distinguished older man in a suit, lecture hall. Dr. Ewen Cameron looked like exactly what he was. One of the most respected psychiatrists in the world. President of the American Psychiatric Association. President of the Canadian Psychiatric Association. President of the World Psychiatric Association. He had helped write the global standards for mental health treatment. Parents trusted him with their children, governments consulted him on policy, and behind a locked door at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, he was doing something to human beings that had never been done before. Cameron had a theory. Mental illness, he believed, was just a pattern. Wrong thoughts, wrong responses, hardwired into the brain over years of experience. His idea was radical but almost logical. What if you could erase those patterns completely? Not through years of therapy, but through direct, aggressive neurological intervention? Strip the mind down to zero, blank slate, then rebuild it. Healthier, better, new. The theory sounds almost reasonable until you see what erasing the slate actually looked like. Visual empty hospital corridor, a bed with restraints, an IV drip. Patients came to Cameron for help. Real people. A woman struggling with mild depression. A man dealing with anxiety after a difficult divorce. A young mother who felt disconnected from her family. They made appointments. They filled out forms. They sat in his office and described their pain. And then they were put to sleep, not sedated for a procedure. Kept unconscious. For weeks. Sometimes months. Through a chemical cocktail that included barbiturates, thorazine, and insulin. A combination that left patients unable to move, unable to speak, barely able to breathe on their own. Fed through tubes, stripped of any awareness of time or self. While they slept, Cameron applied electroconvulsive therapy, electroshock, but not at the calibrated, controlled doses used in standard medical practice. Cameron used doses 25 to 100 times higher than any accepted clinical level. Not once, not twice. Some patients received it twice a day for 30 consecutive days. And here's the part that sounds impossible, but is documented. The shocks were so intense, so far beyond any therapeutic range, that some patients suffered spontaneous bone fractures from the convulsions alone. Their own muscles, seizing violently, snapped their bones. while they were unconscious, while they trusted the man responsible to be healing them. Visual, old medical records, handwritten charts, numbers circled in red. Cameron called this phase depatterning, and when he believed the erasure was complete, when the patient had been reduced to something resembling a conscious infant, he moved to phase 2. He called it psychic driving. Tape-recorded messages, looped, playing continuously through speakers hidden under the patient's pillow. Hour after hour, sometimes 16 hours straight. Positive affirmations, negative suggestions, identity commands, repeated thousands of times directly into the ears of a person too sedated to resist, too broken to question, too lost to even know their own name. The idea was reprogramming, literally, erase the person, insert new instructions, create a new human being in the shell of the old one. Now pause for a second, because what you need to understand is that Cameron knew this wasn't working. Visual, data charts, declining patient outcomes, internal memos. His own records, the ones that survived, showed patients weren't improving. They were deteriorating, catastrophically, permanently. The depatterning wasn't creating blank slates ready for healthy new programming. It was creating irreversible neurological damage, memory loss spanning entire decades, loss of motor function, loss of language, loss of identity at a fundamental biological level. And Cameron kept going, because he wasn't answering to his patients. He was answering to the CIA, and the CIA wasn't paying him to heal anyone. They were paying him to find out exactly how deep the damage could go, and how reliably it could be replicated. Visual, manila envelopes, financial records, front organization names. The funding was buried under layers of fake charitable foundations, innocent-sounding names, untraceable paper trails. Cameron's patients, Canadian civilians, many of them, had no idea that American intelligence money was paying for what was being done to them. Most of his own staff didn't know. The structure was so compartmentalized that the people holding the needles genuinely didn't know who was really holding the money. This is how atrocity gets industrialized, not through cartoon villainy, through paperwork, but then things got darker. Visual, a hotel building at night, a single lit window on the 10th floor. Frank Olson was a CIA scientist, not a victim pulled off the street, an insider, a man who knew about the program from the inside. In November 1953, his colleagues invited him to a retreat. During dinner, they spiked his drink with LSD, without telling him, without his knowledge or consent. Standard MKUltra protocol, testing on people who didn't know they were being tested. Olson had a complete psychological breakdown. 9 days later, he fell from the window of his room on the 10th floor of the Statler Hotel in New York. The government recorded it as suicide. 30 years later, when his family finally had his body exhumed, forensic pathologists found something that didn't match a fall. Blunt force trauma to the skull. A wound consistent with being struck before going through the glass, not after. The case was never officially resolved. It remains open. Visual, Senate hearing room, microphones, rows of men in suits, 1977. MKUltra ran for 20 years, from 1953 to 1973, and it involved not one program, but over 150 separate sub-projects, spread across universities, hospitals, prisons, and private residences across North America. Subjects dosed with LSD for months without consent. Sensory deprivation experiments, hypnosis trials, behavioral manipulation through sexual coercion, drug combinations that had never been tested on humans because no legitimate researcher would have been permitted to try them. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered every file destroyed, and most were shredded, burned. 2 decades of documentation turned to ash over a weekend. But Helms didn't know about the boxes. Somewhere in a records facility, roughly 20,000 documents had been misfiled, routed to a financial archive instead of the intelligence division. They weren't destroyed, they were forgotten, sitting in cardboard boxes, untouched, for 4 years. A 1977 Freedom of Information Act request sent investigators into that archive. They found everything. Visual, document pages spreading across a table, highlighted sections, newsroom footage. The Senate hearings that followed were extraordinary. Survivors testified. Families of the dead testified. And the CIA, cornered by their own surviving paperwork, admitted the program had existed. They called it misguided. They called it an anomaly. They expressed regret in the careful legal language of people who know exactly what they're doing. Cameron never faced justice. He had died in 1967, a respected man, buried with honors, his crimes still classified. Some survivors received small financial settlements. The details were sealed. And then, very quietly, officially, the world moved on. Visual, slow zoom on a single document page, a patient name redacted in black. Here is what no one said out loud during those Senate hearings. The thing that turns this from a historical horror story into something that should make every person alive right now deeply uncomfortable. Cameron's patients weren't captured enemies. They weren't prisoners of war. They were civilians, Canadian and American men and women who walked into a doctor's office, described their pain, and were handed over to a government experiment without their knowledge or consent. The system that enabled this didn't look like a dictatorship. It had licensing boards, it had budget committees, it had the full external architecture of accountability and oversight, and none of that machinery asked the one question that would have ended it. What is actually happening to the person in that room? Visual, modern smartphones, social media feed scrolling, targeted ads, facial recognition. We live in a world more psychologically studied, more behaviorally monitored, more algorithmically influenced than any civilization in recorded history. The tools available today, behavioral prediction engines, neurological profiling, emotional manipulation through curated information feeds, make Cameron's tape loops look like something from a children's science project. The question of who controls what you believe, how you feel, and who you understand yourself to be has never been more consequential. The subjects of MKUltra didn't know they were being experimented on. They trusted the system, they trusted the institution, they trusted the white coat, and that trust, that ordinary, reasonable, human trust, was the precise weapon used against them. Visual, a woman looking at old photographs of herself, trying to remember. Her name was Linda McDonald. She went to Cameron for help with depression. She left not knowing she had children, not knowing her husband's name, not knowing her own face in the mirror. She was 33 years old and had to be taught to speak again, to walk again, to exist again. She spent years rebuilding a life that had been taken from her by a man who was celebrated, decorated, and never prosecuted for what he did. Her story is not a footnote. It is the story. Visual, slow fade to black, a single light. The moment we stop being disturbed by what power can do in secrecy is the moment we stop asking the questions that prevent it from happening again. History doesn't warn us in loud, obvious ways. It whispers, in declassified documents, in survivor testimonies that almost nobody reads, in the quiet erasure of names from public records. MKUltra didn't end because someone stopped it. It ended because someone found the boxes they forgot to burn. Think about what's still in the boxes they haven't forgotten. If this story unsettled you, hold on to that feeling. Subscribe to Dark Sphere, because history doesn't disappear.